Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our sixth and final webinar in our series. We will meet a couple more times for the presentations, and I'll talk more about that later. But this is our final lecture presentation. We're delighted to have you with us again as we continue to explore new perspectives on the Holocaust in Southeastern Europe. Today, it is our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Katarina Damcevic. Dr. Damcevic research centers on the semiotics of hate speech and controversial symbols in post-conflict societies with a regional focus on Southeast Europe. The title of her doctoral dissertation is Semiotics of Hate Speech and Contested Symbols, the Zadom Spremni Ustaša Salute in Contemporary Croatia, which she defended in 2023 at the University of Tartu in Estonia. Katarina was awarded multiple fellowships and grants for her research, including research fellowships in the US-based Dangerous Speech Project, the Humanitarian Law Center in Belgrade, Serbia, and the University of Regensburg in Germany. In spring 2024, Katarina began working as a researcher and academic coordinator in the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg as a member of the CONCUP Research Network. She's also an external associate at the University of Rijeka, a lecturer at the University of Tartu, and a member of the editorial team of the journal Southeastern Europe. So today's lecture is titled The Politics and Legacies of Contested Symbols. The lecture explores how fascist-era symbols, particularly the Zadom Spremni, ready for the homeland, Ustaša Salute, continue to shape political discourse, national identity, and memory culture in post-conflict Croatia. Drawing on semiotic analysis and cultural theory, the lecture will unpack how such symbols are recontextualized in the present to advance state narratives, perpetuate hate speech, and influence memorial practices. Participants will examine the broader implications of contested symbolism in post-socialist Southeast Europe and its relevance for Holocaust education and the politics of remembrance. So we are honored to have Dr. Damcevic with us today and are grateful for her willingness to share her research, insight, and to spend her time with us. So please join me in welcoming Katarina Damcevic. Katarina.
Thank you, Sandra, so much for the kind introduction. And hi, everyone. It's really lovely to join you and to be able to share some insights with you. I'm also very much looking forward to hearing how useful and applicable this might be for your own teaching in particular. So as I told Sandra a bit earlier, I framed this lecture, basically a bit of a presentation / workshop, so that you could also get an insight into particular tools that you could use when it comes to the analysis of contested symbols based on specific examples. So obviously any questions are more than welcome, and I'm also very much looking forward to having a bit of discussion with you throughout this presentation. So hopefully everybody can see the slides. Everything good? Okay. I love to see nodding, so this always helps. Okay, good. And please do tell me if the audio is disrupted at any point. Sometimes with Zoom, depending on how close or far away from the screen I am, it can lag, or if something is not audible, just please let me know. So how I framed today's presentation is basically going from a more general theories and approaches to symbols are basically essentially what are symbols, what are some functions of symbols in nation building, in post-conflict context, in memory politics, to semiotic theory, which I do not intend to burden you with, but simply to give you an insight of a couple of main ideas and why they are of relevance to us, to history educators, and how we can apply them to analysis. Then we will switch to application. So basically looking at specific tools and models and how they help us analyze memory politics, contested symbols, different uses of symbols by political actors, and finally introducing some of my research in development, but this is basically towards the end. So to start off, I wanted to simply draw your attention to various functions that symbols carry in societies. So this specific model is adapted from one very useful reader, and I think this is one chapter that I also shared with you. I'm also very happy to share more that basically addresses functions and uses of symbols in post-conflict societies based on different case studies. So of course, as you can imagine, these functions are not the only functions, but they are among the dominant ones. So maybe even intuitively, when you think about symbols, I think we can um, all think, remember, feel, right, their importance. So thinking, for example, about symbols when it comes to expressions of values of a given culture or connection to current politics. So think, for example, of various symbols that were used in Serbia student protests, various symbols that we see, during the pandemic, during protest movements, revolutions, and such. Very important for us are symbols as a connection to past generations. So they're often a part of collective memory, and Vieran has addressed this during the last presentation. So I'm also sort of building up on what he said, and I will talk very soon about how symbols are parts of collective memory. So they're also signifiers of shared history, so sort of a social bond. They signify group belonging with other people. Um, so I think we also feel this emotional bond to symbols. So there are various effective triggers that symbols can manifest, depending, of course, on how they're used, right? So you think of political discourse or symbols and their representation and framing in particular conflicts. So in this sense, they elicit strong emotional reactions. Uh, as perceptual filters, if you can see this above bubble, so we see this category of selective attention and cognitive attribution. So essentially, selective attention means that when we see a particular symbol, uh, we are also inclined to see a particular aspect of reality or of a given phenomenon. So basically, they sort of narrow down our perception towards a particular issue. So they filter one meaning and emphasize other meanings. As a perceptual filter, they also serve as anchors for us, so for different groups, to assimilate new meanings and also to be able to categorize our belonging to our group versus the other group. So this is simply to say that there are indeed various functions of symbols, and we are narrowing down today in their uses in memory politics and post-conflict societies in particular. So with this, I was wondering and wanted to ask you, so you're welcome to simply say it or write it in the chat. So we spoke about this, or Vienna mentioned some examples of monuments during his last presentation. So I would sort of build on this and ask you to think, especially in the classroom, when you debate and when you discuss with students, what comes to mind when you think about contested symbols or contestation? So what would you say makes a symbol contested? Just a bit of a prompt to start off with.
You can unmute yourself or type in the chat, whatever works best for you.
See, I see something I can follow. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle and Sunshana. So the Confederate flag, pride in region versus historical representation. Sunshana, double meaning. Do you have a specific example, Sunshana, in mind? Or basically just as this feature of contestation, multiple meanings, multiple actors?
Yeah, well, Za dom spremni and your essay explains it really clearly.
Yeah. So you mean this double connotation argument, right, as well?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. We will also, we will get to this. Thank you for sharing. So exactly. So intuitively, I think we're aware that contested symbols are those whose meaning is fought over, by different actors. So we usually have multiple groups, multiple actors who are debating the meaning of symbols. In memory politics, this is usually in order to serve political agendas, to mobilize voters, to present a particular, usually preferred version of the past. So interpretations vary across time, across actors, and across political contexts. It should also be noted, as I discussed very recently with one student, contestation, of course, is something that we need in societies, right? So contestation in itself is necessary. So disagreement, contestation, debates, this is all a part of a healthy or democratic society. However, when symbols are weaponized, when they are misused to basically further exclusion, to communicate denial, and similar aspects, then we also encounter another side of the coin. So basically, the point being that contestation is necessary, but we also need to ask ourselves to what end, right? So what is contested in what way, and what is the purpose of this contestation? So I said that I would briefly mention something about the semiotic approach to symbols and memory, and I will indeed be brief. So again, to build up on what Vieran mentioned last time, so he told you something about, social memory, political memory, cultural memory. And I also wanted to mention in this regard that the Russian-Estonian historian and cultural semiotician Yuri Lotman wrote quite extensively about culture, memory, and history, and essentially is memory as this important mechanism of meaning making. He focused on the ways how history is negotiated, reinterpreted, contested as well, right, through different cultural texts, which he takes as models of behavior. So by text, he means also the things that we produce, right? So we have scientific articles, literature, curricula, declarations, such as, for instance, the Declaration of the Homeland War, legal texts. So all of them, in what way or another, attempt to or aim to communicate a particular guideline, rule, regulation of behavior. And all of these also serve to provide a sense of meaning for a particular society. So for us to make sense of the world that we are a part of, the society and community that we are a part of, but also to create this ideal self-image of a society. So this would also mean that we foster and try to maintain, or politicians try to maintain, those ideal versions of the past, or those versions that they would like to maintain as dominant versions. So in this sense, symbols function as memory condensers, as they're often slogans, flags, monuments, memorials, murals, graffiti as well. Nowadays also digital symbols, memes. They're able to, or we use them in order to basically condense various historical narratives and ideas, which makes them much more, emotionally powerful, easier to transmit, easier to disseminate, and with this much more effective in their presence and in their use. However, what we need to emphasize is that meanings are never static, right? And I think this is quite intuitive, right? So meanings are always a part of some negotiation among actors, especially during crisis, during transformations, during conflicts and wars. So periods of crisis destabilize systems of meaning. So this is, if we were to follow this cultural explosion model that Lotman also advances, he does this to first avoid a deterministic view of history. And by this, I mean deterministic in the sense that, Now, we look at what happened. So, for instance, we look at the 1990s Yugoslav wars, and if we were to come to a conclusion, okay, so this is the only way or the only scenario that was supposed to happen, right? So this was the only logical outcome. However, Lotman tries to emphasize this very unpredictable aspect of also history, of memory, of transformations that do not have to necessarily end in the way that they actually ended. So this is only one of these many potential scenarios that wars and crises can essentially lead to or result in. So this is to say that a society following crisis, following conflicts, doesn't necessarily need to or doesn't necessarily adapt in a positive manner, right? So it doesn't necessarily become more open, more democratic. It can also become much more solidified in its exclusionary narratives. It can become stagnant. It can lead to very exclusionary politics, and we can see this dynamic, unfortunately, in the rise of authoritarian politics in Europe. I don't think I need to mention the US, but in Europe currently, I think we're all looking at what will happen with the elections in Hungary. So meaning different social transformations such as protests, wars, revolutions, transitions do not need to lead to positive outcomes, but also to, unfortunately, negative ones. And symbols serve a very important role here in transferring particular ideas that basically, help us communicate our own positions in those transformations. So I added an image from pandemic times, or basically from the lockdowns, just as a reminder of the masks and the symbol that they became. For some people, they became a symbol of, okay, so health, we are protecting each other, or solidarity or whatnot. To others, especially or often among conspiracy narratives, it also became, a symbol of, okay, so we need to distance ourselves from this. The vaccine is poison, etc. But I think we all do remember this. And nowadays, during the war in Ukraine, sadly still ongoing, there has been a use of various symbols that have been in one way or another weaponized by Russia and by Putin. So for instance, the symbol Z, or za pobjedu, for victory, it has multiple origins, and as of now, I also still haven't found consensus over the dominant meaning. However, it is said to originate from Russian military units, often used on vehicles, public buildings, clothing, and online. It has become a quite prominent tool for contestation, especially in online environments, among pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian groups. So you can see different levels of appropriating war symbols in order to either dehumanize or ridicule Russia's side, or simply reframe the symbol to mean something that would serve more the defense of Ukraine and in solidarity of Ukraine. So as you can imagine, or I'm sure as you know, during conflicts, this affective and emotional aspect of symbols becomes especially prominent. I think one maybe even better example of this is Slava Ukraini. So the Ukrainian salute that has very often been framed by Russia as a Nazi symbol, or as dominantly a Nazi symbol, and salute, which of course has a complex history, but Russia has been trying to tie it primarily to their special military operation, or so-called special military operation. So the question that arises when we talk about these symbols and contestations is basically, how do we systematically approach them? And this is what I wanted to introduce to you as also a particular tool that you can use for your students and pupils. So for this, I have adapted and used this model that I have relied on in the past that I found extremely useful for my own work. And nowadays I'm also developing it for further research. And this is the dangerous speech model. So maybe some of you have heard of it. It is actually a part of one center or institute in Washington, D.C., the Dangerous Speech Project that was developed quite a while ago by Susan Benish and some other associated researchers in order to detect, identify, and analyze different types of speech, text, images that can increase the risk that its audience will condone or commit violence against members of another group. So to be very clear, we will not be framing symbols or particularly the Ustasha salute today along these lines. So I'm not looking at it as a symbol that may or may not lead to violence escalation, but simply using the model in order to show you specific elements that can help analyze such symbols in their wider communicative contexts. So how does the dangerous speech model help analyze symbols? So symbols also have speakers. So they have people, individuals, groups that produce them. They have target audiences, and they also have their operational contexts. A context, of course, is crucial because it contributes directly to how a particular symbol is interpreted. The model also helps us focus the discussion towards function. So we ask ourselves, what does the symbol do socially and politically? What is its dynamic, right? Where does it appear? How? To what ends is it actually used? So this is particularly useful for case comparison. And with that said, I will lead you through the specific example of a very recent case of the use of the Ustasha salute through the lens of this model. So you can also illustrate it more easily and see how it can be applied. So I remember from previous presentations. Добре. Let me use this opportunity to also check. I'm used to following the chat, so give me just 1 second here. Wonderful. Just wanted to say thanks again, Ryan. I saw that you added immediately as a Southerner an example regarding contested symbols, and we will save this for later on for the discussion. I'm very much looking forward to this input. So as I've mentioned just a second ago, Daniel, other colleagues have mentioned, and Vieran during his last presentation, that the Ready for the Homeland salute, so I don't like to articulate it, just to be clear. So you will always hear me, or usually hear me say the Ustasha salute. I don't think it needs to be communicated if it doesn't have to. The Ustasha salute was the official salute of the independent state of Croatia. Banned after World War II and during socialist Yugoslavia, it resurfaced during the 1990s. So it resurfaced, of course, for many reasons. One of them bringing us precisely back to the transformations moment, conflict and crisis moments, when we see the creation of new symbols or the return of existing ones and their renegotiation, their weaponization. So this is something that happened in the 90s with the Ustasha salute, when it was again reintroduced by radical right-wing parties, specifically the Croatian Party of Rights and their paramilitary wing, the Croatian Defense Forces, Hrvatske obrambene snage, who, as a lot of research has shown, used it specifically to evoke the Ustasha legacy. So their uniforms were black. They were using the physical Nazi salute. They chanted the salute. They celebrated the founding of the NDH that takes place on the 10th of April. This is still continued to this day. It seems to lesser capacity. So unfortunately, the salute was not banned during the war. Again, this was a complex dynamic, and it ended up sort of, flying under the radar for many reasons. One of them, which you might have encountered in literature, is also that the Croatia's first president contributed, I would say he still certainly contributed, at least to some extent, to the then relativization of the salute by attempting to equate the Ustaše and Partizani in order to foster this, all Croatian reconciliation or reconciliation on all sides. So among all of those minor tendencies, dynamics, and debates among different political actors, the salute flew under the radar. Of course, the fact, again, that it wasn't legally regulated, it still isn't, does not help the case. So with Croatia's accession to the EU in 2013, we of course saw a bit more control, so a bit more instruments from the European Union simply to maintain, to make sure that Croatia is following everything that is necessary in order to successfully join the European Union, which also means that hate speech, the appearance of nationalist symbolism, Ustaša legacy, were not as prominent, simply because they were more not even penalized, how much they were publicly controlled in one sense, for lack of a better word. After Croatia joined the European Union, however, we saw a more or less consistent rise in waves of historical revisionism and hate speech reflected specifically through the relativization of the NDH legacy and NDH crimes. As hate speech, the salute and its accompanying insignia have a history of targeting Serbs and other minorities, of course, which also included open calls for violence. In this respect, you might remember a case from 2020 when Dinamo football fans, a smaller group, I think teenagers even, had this plakat that said, "We will fuck Serbian women and children," with the Croatian Defense Forces flag and with the salute inscribed. So this was in public in Zagreb. This is only one of many, maybe minor examples. And of course, when it comes to politicians, particularly members of the Croatian Democratic Union Party and certain war veterans organizations, attempt to assign or weaponize the salute to assign a particular preferred meaning to it, which is tied to this double connotation argument that is now used as an excuse to connect the salute to the Croatian War of Independence of the 90s, stating basically that it was used primarily to mark the victory of the war, the defense against the enemy. However, the double connotation argument doesn't hold water, not only from a legal perspective, but also from a purely practical one. So it is a case where you would basically walk around Zagreb or any other city, and if you would say, you would salute the Ready for the Homeland salute and say, okay, but I'm using it now, particularly in this context. So only in the context of the 1990s war. If it were a salute that was created then, of course, then that would change the story. However, since again, it was legitimized as an Ustasha salute, as part of the Ustasha legacy during the 1990s, that wannabe argument doesn't hold water. So I've said that I would focus on one particular case of the salute's appearance in recent months. So I wanted to make this fresher to show you an example of the salute, its use, and how it is framed by different political actors as part of broader symbolic contestation in Croatia. This again through this dangerous speech model. I'm sure that many of you or everybody has heard of Marko Perković Thompson. So this very famous and perhaps most controversial nationalist singer, which would also bring us from contestation to how contested legacies are mainstreamed and how they become part of popular culture. So this is certainly a longer process, and Marko Perković Thompson has been studied as part of heroism studies, right? So how different, how heroes are built, are created and constructed in post-conflict societies. What purpose do they serve? So Thompson is one very good example of this. So he appeared in the 1990s with his song Bojna Čavoglave, so the Čavoglave Battalion, which ultimately became one of the most famous war songs. So he did not rise to fame immediately. So this was also quite a long process, not necessarily linear. But some years later, in around 2000, so he rose to fame also as part of his role as a war veteran. So he was briefly in the 1990s war, and his war identity became very quickly connected to his celebrity character. So it should be noted, of course, that at his concerts, and whoever listened to his songs, some of his songs, they all of his concerts include the Ready for the Homeland salute, especially in the beginning of this Bojna Čavoglave song. Sometimes at his concerts, you could hear phrases such as kill the Serb. Oftentimes you could also see other NDH-related insignia. So I also saw some when I visited his concert, not his concert in the Dvorana Mladosti in Rijeka, but outside. So basically we were having some conversations with the police, with the guests and with the audience, and taking photos of different symbols. So Thompson in quite recently, so in the past 8 months or so, has become much more prominent in Croatia after a break that he had for a few years due to personal issues. So I'm sure that this Hippodrome concert that happened in July in Zagreb, you are all familiar with. But basically, reportedly, the concert had around 500,000 people in attendance. It was well over capacity, also when it comes to physical spaces. But one of the most important aspects of it, which I'm also interested in my developing research, is how state officials both endorsed him, endorsed his concert, but also how they attempted to govern his performances, the meaning of his performances, and with this, the salute. So why is Thompson still extremely interesting for one other reason is this heroic exceptionalism, which basically signifies a figure in society. This can also be a football player. Think, for example, about Josip Šimunić, or war veterans are a great example, of course. So media and society elevate specific figures to a heroic status. However, this heroic status also comes with, transgressions, crossing of boundaries. So this is one playful aspect in a way that also characterizes Thompson. So his performances are an act of transgression, of crossing both legal boundaries, social and moral. However, he still maintains this celebrity hero position. So this brings us to the model that I've mentioned, and what are the elements that we want to look at when we want to analyze or distinguish particular symbols. So again, slogans, flags, in this case, the Ustasha salute in a specific communicative context. So now, in order not to digress, let's stick with the concert and think about the elements. So the first element that the model emphasizes is the message. So the message can be understood very widely, again, as being an image, a text, a slogan, a flag, or a memorial. A message in itself isn't the aspect that is crucial for us. It is the interactivity of the other elements. So for instance, if I would tell you now as a group, I would tell you, okay, oh my God, I really, I hate this group. If I would say I hate you, this isn't either controversial, it's not hate speech, because it can have an educational purpose, but more importantly, you are not a community that I am addressing in such a way because you are marginalized, right? That you are discriminated against. However, if I would change context, right? If I would switch contexts and target a community of Serbs in Vukovar or any other similar area, of course, my words would have a completely different connotation, whether by implication or more explicitly. So a message in itself is not enough for us to also distinguish, okay, what is actually happening here, right? And what are the elements that may make this message more problematic, more divisive, more polarizing? Which brings us to the speaker. So we ask ourselves, is the speaker influential? If they are, in what way? Depending on culture, on society, on customs, on norms, religion, they can have an elevated social status. They can have political office, charisma, or any other aspects that come to mind. And please feel free to write in the chat if you get any associations related to this. So think back on Thompson. He is an influential speaker. He has the power to reach wide audiences, especially in the younger generations. He's a part of popular culture. He communicates and performs memory aspects that are tied to collective trauma, to legacies of war, which also makes his performances much more emotional and effectively triggering for different communities. However, sometimes even more important than the speaker itself are second speakers. So now I would also ask you to please feel free to jump in. What do you think intuitively, who would be the second speaker? Who might this person be, and why would this person matter? You're welcome to unmute or write in the chat.
I'm not necessarily sure if I'm understanding correctly, but if we're saying like a leader, say like a political leader, okay, so the political leader would be that influencer, right? They have a political office, they most likely have some charisma, whatever. The second speaker would be kind of their second in command, their vice president or whatever. And it just legitimizes what the original speaker is talking about.
Thank you, Michelle. So exactly, partly. So precisely when you mentioned the second speaker legitimizes, so endorsement, meaning it doesn't even necessarily have to be, a figure such as vice president or somebody, like second in command, so to say, or somebody who is in political office. However, it's anyone who can further endorse, disseminate what this first speaker communicated. So, for instance, when Trump endorses different radical right-wing groups from other countries on Twitter, I mean, when Twitter was Twitter, right? So he has the reach, he can disseminate widely, and of course, by this reach, a much wider audience. Which makes him an important and dangerous second speaker. In the case of Thompson, we have the Croatian Democratic Union, or Hrvatska demokratska zajednica, and our prime minister, who visited Thompson the day before the concert with his family to take pictures, to congratulate him, to support him, right? I will also show an example how he endorsed the concert later on. So when we have this level of legitimization, right, it even further legitimizes and normalizes, relativizes the original message in question. And the tricky thing is that nowadays, of course, with social media, messages that would have stayed maybe within a more closed environment or simply wouldn't have such a wide reach can now reach an audience that is transatlantic. So with this, I remembered, and it might be also of interest to some, when I mentioned transatlantic, our colleague Nikolina Zidek recently published a book on basically transgenerational memory of the diaspora in Argentina. So basically the legacies and nasljednici. I'm blocking with the words nasljednici. Basically the Ustaša emigre in Argentina and how they build their connections not only with the legacies of NDH, but also the legacies of the 1990s war in Croatia, especially the younger generation who was born in Argentina, raised in Argentina, and had connections with the war only through social media.
Would the word be successors? Is that what you mean?
Successors, yeah, thank you. I was literally just blocking, so thinking, nasljednici, but yes, precisely. I'm happy to share this. It just came to mind. I'm very much looking forward to her book talk on this issue. Great. We will get to the comments. Yeah, thank you, Lori, and I see also Maria. Precisely. Yeah, social media certainly has a stronger impact on these speakers, and I like that you put speakers in quotes. Because one of my students recently pointed out quite fairly that it's very tricky for us to analytically distinguish or be able to distinguish, are these speakers, human on social media? Because there are so many bots, there is so much production of various texts and narratives and reactions and slogans that we actually don't know where they're coming from. So possibly this, tweak to what constitutes the second speaker might be necessary, but this is something, for another time. So this is just an image of Thompson from from a couple of years back during one of his concerts from news media, simply as a reminder or simply to show him as the speaker. After the speaker, we have the audience, right? So we need to ask ourselves, who is the target audience of this speaker? Whether it is Thompson, whether it is Trump, whether it is a particular war veteran or somebody else. Can we distinguish who their target audience actually is, if they even have any, right? What might make this audience more susceptible or more likely to be sympathetic to the message? So again, of course, this depends on cultural context, social norms. So this can include, what our attitude towards authority is, right? So how a particular society, and even if they are inclined to protest, to oppose something, or whether they will simply, say, okay, but doesn't matter, whether they're more passive, they won't react. So this lack of reaction is also a reaction. And one concern that arose during and after Thompson's concerts, in the general public, via different NGO organizations, anti-fascist organizations, was specifically, the number of people that attended his concert, but many of whom also said, I'm just going because my friends are going. So this was the case with one of my friends' kids who's in high school, 15, and he doesn't know any of the Thompson songs other than Boj na Čavoglave, but he went because his whole class went. So basically, there's also this issue of how simply the presence of such an audience, right? The attendance, the act of just being and not seeing what is the problem, right? Not detecting, what is problematic here with the symbolism, with the normalization of symbolism, with the historical revisionism that comes with it. Why this essentially makes the overall message, slogan, and environment more potentially polarizing, or why it can contribute, because we have a community that doesn't see what the problem is, or those that don't see a problem are much louder. So how to mitigate this, right? So how to get to the point where we are back at this level that we see the presence of the Ustasha salute as an actual issue, but don't allow it at concerts. So what are the relevant aspects of the context in which this message, the symbol, appears? So what is the local history related to the issue? So when we talk about the Ustasha salute, we are then again back to the legacy of war, legacy of trauma, social factors, economic factors, if any, historical factors, in some places, of course, geographical, if we're talking about fight over resources in certain communities. But here, no, we want to see the context in which this particular symbol appears. So one difficult example. Does anybody have? I heard something. Tatiana. All good. Okay. So if you remember,
I was just want to
da,
it's
da,
possible
please.
that the target audience is younger people. I teach in a high school, and in some time I have very, very awful situation. I have some workshops about the Holocaust with kids for 14 or 15 years. And we talk about Holocaust in Europe, and then we talk about Croatia. And it was one girl I also lack of the words because naježila sam se jednostavno, if Sandra can help me. We talk about NDH and the Jasenovac and Serbs and Roma people and everybody else. And the girl said, okay, they kill us, so Serbs must be killed. I was walking in some nightmare. I couldn't believe that something like that happened. They were just talking about the people who influenced them. And one girl said about Severina, and another girl said, no, she's not good because she was talking about Thompson. She said some ugly words about him. I said, okay, what do you know about Thompson? Do you know the song about Jasenovac and Gradiška Strana? Because she said, it doesn't matter. He talked about his Dida, who said what happened in the past and everything else. And this Thompson, I don't know. It's for me like some nightmare. I don't know. In the future, I'm 60 years old, and in 4 or 5 years, I will go to retirement. I don't know what will happen with the history with these kids because I feel like somebody wants to erase the history about anti-fascism and partisans and NOB and everything else. I'm really trying in all years that I teach those kids, but I don't know when I gone who will be there. I'm really worried about that. If I can talk to you and said that because I really in the classroom have that thing with the Thompson.
Yeah, thank you, Tatiana. Hvala
Yeah.
puno na, thank you for sharing. It would be great to hear also during our soon to be Q&A more on this because exactly it is indeed I also don't have a solution, and it's a complete conundrum to me, especially the way how at least I personally feel. I'm purposefully saying personally, how from Plenković to other politicians are oftentimes essentially gaslighting their citizens that there is no problem.
I just want to say something else.
Please.
I like football very much. I was watching all their shows and everything else, but when I see the Thompson, all those guys in the bus when they came to Croatia, and I see those footballers in some videos that they sing some songs from NDH and everything else, I really don't want to look at them. I feel they are not from my country. They don't represent myself. You know what I mean? And it's so ugly for the kids who are living now that think they are their idols, those people who are not good. I'm sorry, but they really need to talk with you because you talk about Thompson and it's this topic in everyday life. I'm sorry.
Precisely. I mean, that's why I also wanted to frame it a bit, to draw from, we started from more, of course, history-oriented, archival research as well towards also more contemporary, say, ramifications, reverberations of the past. But hvala još jednom. We will continue soon. So basically, this also feeds into what Tatiana just mentioned and some others I saw in the chat. So this is something that we also need to, encourage. Our students, ourselves, the wider community, to consider. So to think, how was the message shared, right? So what is the medium? How does that particular medium fit into the larger media landscape? Because of course, and I'm sure you're very aware, there is a huge implication, or it's much more difficult to get an insight into what is going on in your country, in your society, if you have only one source of news, or if you don't have, right, any sources of news. So my friend, for instance, whose family is from Siberia, she hasn't been there for years for obvious reasons. She tells me, very often, the Kremlin just, switches off a particular messaging service. Something constantly happens that they're, cut off from credible sources. So basically, this is something we're asking ourselves, and in the case of this medium, right, social media is also one thing that exacerbates what Thompson essentially communicates, performs at his concerts. So I would just sort of not even transition, but mention to you, among all of these contestations, including, Thompson's example, including whether it's Šimunić and the use of the salute in football, or war veterans, or other communities and politicians. Institutions also have, of course, their role. We have a role as educators to communicate our position based on established scholarly research. And with this, I just wanted to share with you also the public statement of our center that we published some months ago, specifically in response to the debates and discussions regarding the meaning of the salute. I will share the link, of course, also in the sources, so you can read the full statement. It is not long. So this is also one mode of how we attempt to govern, stabilize meaning. Before I summarize, I'm drawing towards the conclusion here. I'm curious to hear. We can also save this actually for the discussion. When you think about this dangerous speech model and how it can be useful and applied to analyzing symbols, contestation practices. So if you had to choose one, or is there one element that would be particularly useful to you? So whether it's, the medium, speaker, audience, or something else. And which of the elements would you say matters the most, if any? Basically, just a bit of, food for thought, and we can, of course, then continue. So as I've shown you this public statement and mentioned, how meaning is governed. So this is something that I am trying to develop now in my own research, to basically try to see and analyze how meaning is governed, especially in conflict and crisis context, but also in post-conflict context, such as Croatia. So I want to look at more closely how actors manage symbols, language, to shape collective understanding and secure authority. Because basically, how politicians and legal practitioners frame something is also something that heavily influences the citizens' subsequent interpretation, perception and reception of it. So this is basically tied to what I earlier mentioned, that texts such as curricula, manifests, laws, declarations serve as somewhat guidelines and models of behavior for people. And I think this is fairly prominent in the declaration of the Homeland War, that in its third point explicitly states that the Croatian people need to accept, univocally accept the meanings and values of the Homeland War. And of course, you can see how such a point, točka u deklaraciji, such a point in the declaration that requires this tacit acceptance by citizens, right, of this one dominant interpretation, doesn't leave much room for actual debate and for a more healthy discussion, right, of associated traumas and legacies of the war. So this is why I'm quite interested also in how governments and politicians manage contestation, how they manage contested meanings when symbolic conflict emerges. When I say symbolic conflict, I mean specifically now in the case of Thompson, or other related examples of the salute's still unfortunate presence. This also ties into interpretive authority, right? So how do these actors actually shape the interpretive conditions under which we assess meaning, right? So is this open to us? Are these interpretive conditions, flexible in the sense that are citizens comfortable and feel competent in actually, having enough information to make an informed decision? Or is a particular interpretation and vision imposed on them? Because there is a huge difference. And with this, I apologize, I skipped one slide that ties precisely to interpretive authority that I've mentioned now. I hope you can see Andrei Plenkovic's statement in one of his reactions to the Thompson's concert, and maybe even more like effectively, meaning emotionally powerful, so to say, the statement by Ivan Anušić, Croatia's Minister of Defense. You can read them yourselves, of course. In red, I added denial, as one prominent characteristic of this particular framing by the Prime Minister, basically saying, why are people even reacting to, Thompson and Ustasha symbol on his concerts, as if that's a problem. So blatantly denying that there even is a problem. So this is also something that influences the interpretive conditions that citizens are a part of, especially coming from an influential speaker. Whereas with Anušić, if you have something to comment on, please feel free. For the life of me, this is not something I can coherently comment on. But seemingly, Thompson epitomizes Croatian values or true Croatian values, whatever those might be. Yeah. So what I wanted to communicate today is essentially that symbols are also carriers of memory, of identity, of trauma. They're debated not only because of their historical origins, but also because of what they say about our wider context, about certain aspects of history that are unresolved or more often even weaponized. I'm emphasizing this because it's usually not only about the symbol itself, but we're looking at what the symbol triggers. What are the wider social issues and political issues that it amplifies? When it comes to semiotics, it helps us, move from, okay, I see this symbol, it's offensive or it's problematic, to try and map out, how it is used, how meaning is actually constructed, what is the dynamic, to which purpose is it used, and of course by whom. Important for educators, which of course means all of us, is also to help students to simply see how the past is mobilized, how it's politicized and weaponized to shape contemporary agendas. And I think nowadays, within such a volatile environment that we seem to find ourselves in from multiple sides, this becomes even more important. So this, how the past comes back, it's sort of, what do the politicians take? What is the element that they take from history and make it prominent now, to make it useful? Why does it become useful now? And what do they try to accomplish for better or worse? And in this sense, the dangerous speech model helps us analyze broader communicative environments that the symbols appear in. Lastly, what I would sort of like to be, this takeaway, we're trying to somehow equip ourselves in critically analyzing and actually recognizing when symbols and the contestation of symbols begin to function as instruments of exclusion, of distortion and denial rather than of a healthy discussion, right? Rather than of a healthy, open debate. And I would conclude with this